Hi, you're listening to the Business Essentials Daily Summer Series, the best episodes of 2022. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. There's data that suggests that inbound phone calls convert at a much higher rate and are often more valuable compared to inquiries via other inbound channels. So why are businesses still not picking up the phone? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. It can be too easy to let the phone go to voicemail or just answer emails. But what opportunities are you missing out on by letting the phone ring out? James Smith is the CEO of digital agency Smith Brothers Media. And he says that while it might seem archaic, connecting with the real human being brings an effectiveness that's hard to replicate with a social media post. He also suggests call tracking as another great way to gain insight into the activity of potential customers and the path they've taken to get to you. But first, I asked James if, due to months of COVID lockdown, business calls were made and answered more or less, and are we following the same pattern now?
Lockdowns had a huge impact on business, and I think one of the things that we can see very clearly is obviously inquiries for most businesses were down in general. But when we actually look at the question, what's the pattern, the rate of those type of inquiries from emails to Facebook messages, Instagram and phone calls, what we found was the quality of inquiry actually increased as an average. And so what we found from that is people, when they needed a service, they needed a service. The tire kickers almost left.
Right.
So what we then found through that is phone calls became the predominant way that people were getting in contact. Now, the challenge, as we all know, with lockdowns that we've had over the last 2 years across the globe, is we had to work remotely. Now, people were not set up with great phone systems, automated answering services, and what we noticed as a whole across pretty much all our client base is that actually a lot of those phone calls went unanswered, even more so than usual. So I think that's been one of the patterns we've noticed. Phone calls have been dropped even further. Now, the question of what's happening now, unfortunately, we're still living in this kind of COVID way of working. And if you look at the number of people back in offices, the problem we've now got is they're sometimes in the office, sometimes not. And those systems that they've got for answering the phone, they're not flexible. And quite often we're finding, particularly in B2B or service-based businesses, those calls, systems are not working, and those calls are still being unanswered at the higher rate that we saw in lockdown. So yes, it is a problem, and it's something that businesses need to address.
Well, why do customers prefer to call, James?
I think rather than saying why do customers prefer to call, why is it valuable customers prefer to call? And this is the key point is, let's all be honest, when we run a business or you're in charge of sales, we all get bombarded with inquiries. And it's our job as a sales team or a marketer in a business is to qualify those calls and those inquiries and those chats and everything else that comes in. The challenge is there's so much. We're bombarded with all this input, and digital has created that. But what we don't realise is through this noise, the most valuable is the call. Now, why is it that the most valuable customers like to call? Because they're committed. They've taken the time to pick up the phone. They're actually willing to have a conversation, a two-way conversation with a person rather than an anonymous text message or anonymous email or filling out an inquiry form or ticking yes for get in touch with me. They're actually willing. And also, not only are they willing to have that conversation, they're doing it right there and then in the moment. They have a higher degree of need for whatever it is they're trying to inquire about. So when we look at the breakdown of value of inquiry type, you will always find that inbound phone call inquiries convert at a much higher rate and often are also more valuable as an individual transaction when compared with other inbound inquiry forms.
So, James, how do you know that an inquiry is actually valuable and worth following up?
The way in which we work with our clients to make sure we understand that to the ultimate degree is tracking. So there's lots of different forms of tracking. And most of the time, and for those listeners right now, I ask the question and you can answer it in your heads, do you actually know where every single one of your inquiries comes from? And do you know what their actual source was? And you'll be surprised how many people can't actually answer that question. They might have an idea of how many deals are currently in the pipeline, but they won't be able to tell you how many original inquiries and where they came from. So there's a few little different bits of technology that we can use to do that. Obviously, there's Google Analytics for tracking web, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, and they all have their own tracking parameters for inquiries, and that's great, and that's easy. But when it comes to phone calls, people quite often get a little bit confused or not sure how to do it. And they might just have a question that the receptionist asks, where did you find us? But there's actually technology that allows you to do that right now, to the point where phone tracking isn't just a case of having 10 different phone numbers you put on your different advertising materials. There's dynamic numbers that exist that actually marry up digital visitation to a website or a social channel and then link that back to a phone call with a timestamp. So highly recommend anyone out there who doesn't currently do phone tracking to get onto it. Delicon is a company that we use, and they're very good, and it gives you all that insight. What's also very clever is you can actually check on whether calls are being answered or not. So you can check in on your sales team, but also understand the value of those inquiries by listening to the calls and associating a dollar figure, which then goes back to your marketing efforts.
That's incredible insight. So with a phone in everyone's hand these days, it's surprising that some businesses still don't pick up the phone. Why?
I think in a day and age where we're all so busy and we're almost more worried about the public perception of the conversation. So social media has been almost a bit of a distraction in some ways for some businesses. And so they'll be probably more worried about the likes or the comments and replying to those and the email inquiries because it's tangible, it's in front of them, and it can also be done on a timeline that suits their work schedule. Now, phone calls, that's not the case. When the phone rings, you can't just say, oh, I'll answer that in 5 minutes' time. And that, I think, is one of the core problems. We're now living in a day and age where we can do things at our leisure when we need to in a time frame that suits us. Phone calls, you can't. You need to be available. You need to answer the phone at that moment in time. And we're all busy. So having systems and processes set up to be able to do that is the answer. But I think, back to your question, why? It's purely just down to we're busy people. And there's no excuse, though.
No, that's right. That's right. It could be money out the door. So to wrap up, James, for those business owners and staff who still aren't convinced, they're a little bit afraid to pick up the phone, why are phone calls so important for businesses?
So we did a study last year on 2 years of previous phone call data that we tracked across all of our clients, across all their paid media. So that means these are genuine inquiries. It's new business. It's not existing clients. It's all new business. And on average, just under 20% of the phone calls that came from those channels, brand new inquiries via phone, went unanswered. So rather than convincing people, I think the answer for business owners is to track and be aware when a phone call goes unanswered. As soon as you start becoming aware of the problem, you start doing something about it. And that is the biggest challenge. At the end of the day, your business, if you're not tracking calls and you do not have a system in place, you're probably losing around about 15 to 20% of your opportunity and growth. And that's huge. So if you take every dollar you spend on marketing, you could reduce that cost by 20% just by answering the phone. It's that simple.
That was James Smith, CEO at Smith Brothers Media. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.